What's going on, guys? This is the Red Rogue, and I hope you're all doing well today. As the first episode of the series got such positive feedback, I decided we're going to go through every dungeon in Shadowlands Season 4 and cover many of the ways that rogues can cheese mechanics to do the most damage possible while also taking the least damage possible. That's right, we're back with another episode of Can You Cloak It, the hit rogue series where we go over every boss fight in a Mythic Plus dungeon and ways we can use our impressive defensive toolkit to either mitigate or flat out ignore mechanics. For this episode, we'll be looking into Tazavesh Streets of Wonder. The video will be time-stamped, segmented to each boss and topic that we'll be going over, so feel free to skip around and maybe even leave a like or a comment if you enjoy the way I do things on the channel or if the video is helpful to you. Also, please note, I'm a one-man show, so if there are any tips or tricks that I don't mention in this video, then feel free to share them. They might be ones I already know, but I'm trying to cover a bunch of different topics all at once, so I didn't have time to include it, but if it's something I didn't know, then I'd appreciate your insight. I try my best to test every ability possible for these episodes, but sometimes I also don't get picked for certain mechanics ever, and when I'm doing this stuff, it just doesn't happen, so I don't get recordings of it, so do keep that in mind. This is one of the two Shadowlands era dungeons that are active in the Season 4 Mythic Plus rotation, and it has a sizable amount of ways that we can take advantage of all of our defensives. I primarily cover boss encounters in this series, but will occasionally mention some noteworthy or useful trash or dungeon tips and tricks as well. Starting off the dungeon, we have Zo'phex, or as I like to call him, Discount General Grievous. This jerk has one major move that I've seen ways we can mitigate or avoid, but there are a couple parts of this move, so we're going to go over multiple sections of it. The biggest one, and the one I'm sure you've seen me do on my live streams if you stop in on Tuesdays and Fridays, is the Interrogation ability. This move puts a big red arrow on your head, and when the cast ends, you'll be trapped in a containment cell that must be DPS down to free you before Zo'phex gets a little too close and personal with those blender arms of his. For this move, just use Cloak of Shadows before the cast expires if you're targeted, and voila! No trap to deal with, and you won't have to run away and pray that your Warlock actually noticed anything other than his DPS meters. Now, you might be thinking you can be a sneaky boy and use Vanish to stop this cast. While this will stop Zo'phex from targeting you, it will cause him to just recast the ability immediately and it'll pick someone at random. So don't ever Vanish this cast unless you just want to troll people in your group. Now, I guess I will say I have seen exactly one time ever where someone vanished the interrogation cast right as it ended, and it actually did prevent the cast from going out, and he didn't try to recast it again. But the timing would have had to have been so precise that it was kind of blind luck, and I don't think it's really worth trying unless you practice this a ton before doing it in real keys. Another good bit of info on the interrogation ability is that if someone does get put into the containment cell, there is an explosion of group-wide damage when they're freed from it. For this, just use Feint to reduce the damage by a ton, as on high keys this can hit really hard. Since Streets of Wonder has a fairly open path for which bosses you do in what order, we're going to go over Grand Menagerie next just because that's usually what I do second. This fight has 3 separate bosses, and each one has a number of mechanics. For the first 2 bosses, Alcrux and Acolyte, nearly every move they have can be immune with Cloak of Shadows, since they're either shadow or holy damage. However, I will give you a couple suggestions of which ones to use this mighty defensive on. For Alcrux, his Grip of Hunger is a very annoying run-away from boss style mechanic, which means DPS lost due to not hitting the jerk. So I personally use Cloak of Shadows for the very first Grip of Hunger, which happens early in the encounter, usually within like the first 10 seconds I think. This way I can pop all my cooldowns and not have to worry about losing stacks of flagellation or wasting trinkets and stuff like that. Grand Consumption is those big blue balls that explode in a pattern around the room, so just sidestep and avoid them to get around him in melee range, and don't waste Cloak for this since it's pretty easily avoidable. Lastly, Gluttony doesn't do any damage to you unless you're standing in someone else's Gluttony circle, which is what they use to suck up the animal balls in the rest of the fight. The damage is fairly minimal, so just stay away from the person who has it, and that's easy enough to do. For Acolyte, the Purification Protocol cast is able to be immune with Cloak of Shadows. This is that big huge circle that he puts on 2 players randomly and they explode after 6 seconds, and it damages anyone inside that radius. Ideally, your healer will at least dispel the melee DPS, so that way they don't have to run away from the boss or accidentally damage the tank, but if not, then you can use Cloak of Shadows to remove this explodey debuff. Venting Protocol is Acolyte's main mechanic in this encounter, as he spawns those sweet anima orbs that give you a stacking damage boost if you suck them up with the Gluttony debuff present. However, if you don't have Gluttony on you and you run into an anima ball, not only do you receive a burst of damage in a small radius around that orb, your damage dealt is reduced by 5%, and this stacks every time you hit a ball. If by bad luck or not paying attention that you run into them, you can use Cloak of Shadows to remove the debuff. Lastly is Venza Goldfuse, the greedy goblin that started this whole mess in the Menagerie. She only has 2 abilities, Whirling Annihilation and Chains of Damnation. While this series may be called Can You Cloak It, these moves, unfortunately, cannot be cloaked. However, we do still have some good tricks up our sleeves for this fight. For Chains of Damnation, you'll be rooted if you're the unlucky one that's chosen for the cast, and your movement speed is reduced by 100%. These chains normally need to be DPS'd off you so you get your movement speed back, but you can in fact use Vanish to free yourselves from the chains and save your group some time from not having to switch targets to damage them. As for Whirling Annihilation, our trick is a little harder to pull off. This move pulls you into the speedy death circle, and when this happens, you actually just want it to suck you in while you're directly facing Venza, and pop evasion before you're in the spinny death circle. This will let you immune the damage from the cast and still hit her the entire time that you're in that circle. Just be very careful not to turn away from her, as evasion only works when you're facing the attacker. Depending on if you have the Gluttony debuff or not, or if there's just a ton of anima orbs floating around in the room during your fight, you might want to have Cloak of Shadows available for this part too. That way you can immune any anima balls that may pass through the boss while you're being sucked on. And there is absolutely no way this can ever be taken out of context ever. Next, we have the Mailroom Mayhem encounter, where we'll combat the Postmaster. This fight has numerous abilities that we can cheese in a multitude of ways. Probably the most important one to know about is Money Order. This is the huge group soak that drops a ton of gold on you and it deals a bunch of physical damage. If you get this move, simply run out from your team before the cast ends and pop evasion by yourself. That way you take 0 damage and no one in your group has to help you soak it, which means less damage being applied to everyone. If you don't have evasion available and you need the group to help you soak, then be sure to pop Feint, as that will help mitigate some of the damage taken. Hazardous Liquids is a double whammy effect, where a bunch of goo will fly out around the room and leave these purple puddles on the floor. If you soak the impact circle, it won't leave a puddle on the floor, but it will apply a nasty debuff. Cloak of Shadows can be used to prevent this debuff or to remove it after the fact. Later on, when you're grabbing those explosive packages and throwing them in the correct mail chute, you might see a package landed in some of those purple puddles that your range DPS probably didn't help soak. If need be, you can also use Cloak of Shadows to run in and grab a package if there is one in that puddle and you won't take any damage. Next, your healer will infinitely appreciate you and give you power infusion every time if you use Feint when the fan mail cast is going off. This ability does a massive amount of group-wide damage, so just pop Feint and bask in the glory of being the only DPS that actually remembers that healers are people too. And if all else fails and you're about to have a 1% wipe because your Warlock wouldn't run any packages because they'd lose too many GCDs, resulting in a parcel exploding, then be sure to have Cloak of Shadows available. The explosion is fire damage, meaning you can potentially save the pull even if you lose a couple people. Next we have Myza's Oasis, a very drawn out trash boss fight, woo. This first half is simply power sliding while playing the solo to Freebird and getting haste and damage buffs or whatever. Technically, you can use Cloak of Shadows to stand in those nasty green rotten food things, but really you should be avoiding those anyhow because there aren't that many of them, and unless you're just really unlucky and slide into one by accident, then you really shouldn't get hit by one ever. Once Zogron enters the fray because you wouldn't play Smells Like Teen Spirit for the 84th time, we'll have at least one decent use of Cloak of Shadows up ahead. When he does Suppression Spark, that move that sucks everyone into the middle of the room, you'll probably notice your musical notes appearing on the ground at the same time. Now, if you're too close to other players when these circles around you pop, then you all do a bunch of arcane damage to each other. So instead, just simply pop Cloak of Shadows when you see your musical notes hit the floor, then power slide with your special action button and get your buff refreshed easy peasy. Finally, we have Zo'asmi. Frankly, the only super important thing you can use in this fight that I've seen is Cloak of Shadows. You can use this if you decide to ignore the Shuri mechanic, which is that big growing circle that puts a nasty debuff on you if you pass through it. That's really the only super useful thing I've seen so far, so feel free to share any other tricks you might have for him. And while these aren't rogue-specific things, if you happen to be Venthyr or Night Fae, then you can use Door of Shadows or your Soul Shape to just blink through the walls of the Divide if you need to and you don't want to deal with any of the things, or you can use it to get around Shuri as well, though that isn't really a rogue-specific trick. Now, for the final chunk of these videos, I usually mention a couple of annoying trash ads or things you can do to deal with the dungeon easier. Streets of Wonder has the ever-annoying and time-consuming trading market minigame, where you need to trade an item that you get from this vendor by the entrance to Myza's Oasis, and other brokers in the area will give you a secret passphrase if you just give them stuff they want. Rogues, 9 times out of 10, are going to be the ones stuck doing this, so I'll give you some quick pointers as to how I do this trading minigame thing so quickly. You'll want to make sure you have Vanish, Sprint, and your major movement ability off cooldown before you start this. As Outlaw, that means Grappling Hook, and for Assassination and Subtlety, you'll have Shadow Step to work with, though it is a little trickier, since you need a target to Shadow Step too. I also always use Venthyr for my Covenant, and for the Soulbind I choose Theotar. He will have a choice on his tree to give you 2 charges of Door of Shadows, which helps make the market a ton easier. Depending on how lucky you get with your market order and who wants what, you might not even need all of your movement abilities, but I generally start off with Sprint and Grappling Hook if I need to traverse a long distance quickly. Distract can be used to stop the patrolling smaller groups of enemies, plus being in stealth makes them far less likely to see you. Also, the radius around each of the broker traders is pretty big, so you can just use the edge of the interactable area to avoid trash patrols more easily. You'll eventually get targeted by one of the bigger broker strong-arm enemies, or whatever they're called, who will find you even if you're in stealth with one of those big red fixate lines, but you can use Gouge or Kidney Shot to briefly slow him down so the rest of your group can start beating him up while you're doing all the busy work. Door of Shadows lets you skip some of the patrolling enemies too, since it's basically a teleport, and even if you do pull them, you can pop Vanish to reset their aggro. There are also several weak ores to help you remember where the locations of each vendor and their desired items are, so if you have trouble, then I highly recommend searching on wago.io for one of the Veiled Market trading game weak ores that are out there. Anyways folks, I hope these tips and tricks help you tackle Streets of Wonder a little bit more confidently. There are plenty of nasty debuffs and other things that you can get rid of with Cloak and Vanish and all that, so never hesitate to try and use our OP cooldowns to help yourself and your group complete that key a little easier. If the video was helpful to you, then please consider leaving a like, a comment, or maybe subscribing to the channel. I try to cover as much Rogue and World of Warcraft stuff as I can over here, and also stream every Tuesday and Friday over on Twitch if you want to stop in and ask a question. As always, my appreciation and gratitude to all of my viewers, and especially my patrons, who all help make these Shiba Shenanigans possible. Thank you all so much for watching. This is the Red Rogue, and I'll see you guys around.